literate, in large part due to the International Adult Literacy Survey, or IELTS, that was conducted by the OECD in the mid to late 1990s. And the OECD conceived of literacy as much more than being able to read and write at a basic level. And in their survey of a number of developed countries, including New Zealand, when the results were released, it was announced that between 40 and 50% of citizens in traditionally literate countries did not have sufficient literacy skills to do well in today's knowledge economy and society. So this is the fundamental reason I chose to look at adult literacy policy in a developed country. Firstly, there have been very few studies that have been conducted on a national adult literacy policy agenda, and even fewer that have investigated developed countries' efforts to institute reforms in adult literacy following IELTS. The second reason I've looked at recent policy is that in recent years there's been shifts in social policy, starting around the 1980s, away from more social welfare approaches to policy towards more neoliberal ones, and again in more recent years, an alleged shift again away from certain neoliberal policies. And I'll go into these concepts more deeply in a few moments. But suffice to say that there have been shifts in the political economy in recent decades that makes policy from this era of particular interest and importance. You may still be wondering, however, why look at adult literacy policy in New Zealand? Why not another developed country such as Canada, for example, or Germany, another country that undertook IELTS? Is it just because I'm from there? Despite having 15 times more sheep than people, New Zealand makes for an ideal case study in which to look at adult literacy policy. With a population of only 4 million, it's been able to institute reforms at a scale unthinkable in larger nations. It has a political economy very similar to other nations, such as Canada or the UK to some extent, and it is known for its extreme neoliberal reforms in the 80s and 90s, and its shift away from some of those reforms more recently, and its more recent focus on adult literacy. So the purpose of my dissertation was to better understand the scope, characteristics, and drivers of recent adult literacy policy in New Zealand. And this study fills a gap in the literature in two fundamental ways. Firstly, in its investigation into what adult literacy policy looks like, how it came about, and what responses and experiences to policy have been, and secondly, in its investigation into the interconnection between political ideology, policy, and adult literacy, and practice in adult literacy. So I drew on a political economy lens to investigating recent adult literacy policy, looking specifically at how neoliberalism and later inclusive liberalism in the third way have impacted policy in New Zealand. So what do I mean by neoliberalism? And this is a term that we hear a lot, but it is seldomly defined. So here I am using John Gray's definition as the belief that market forces are most efficient and effective at allocating resources. And as Canadian scholar John Ralston Saul has observed, neoliberal policy results in a viewing of the world through economic prism. So New Zealand undertook what a number of scholars have called a neoliberal experiment, starting in the 1980s under the traditionally left-leaning Labour government, this is under Prime Minister David Lange, and continuing and intensifying under the New Right National Party, under the leadership mostly of Prime Ministers Jim Bolger and Jenny Shipley, in power until 1999. I also looked at the influence of inclusive liberalism and the third way on more recent policy. And what do I mean here by inclusive liberalism? So this is a theory developed by New Zealand sociologist David Craig and former World Bank economist Doug Porter to describe some of the changes that have been happening in policy in organizations such as the World Bank and in governments such as New Zealand, starting in the late 20th century and continuing on the first part of this decade. So according to Craig and Porter, as well as others who have investigated inclusive liberalism, that there's been a shift away from some certain neoliberal approaches to an emphasis on inclusion in four fundamental ways. The inclusion of marginalized individuals in social and economic life, the inclusion of different branches of government in the creation of policy, the inclusion of state, market, and civil society actors creating policy, and finally the inclusion of both economic and social outcomes of policy. According to Canadian political scientist Rhian Mann, inclusive liberalism is very much like neoliberalism in the fact that it places the market as key, but unlike neoliberalism, the inclusive liberal state feels responsible for addressing some of the market's failures. So we can see a focus on skills and literacy as one of these attempts to address such market failures. I also drew on the work of sociologist Anthony Giddens and his ideas of the political doctrine of the third way that he promoted for centre-left governments throughout the 1990s in particular, most well known for Tony Blair's ideas in the UK, that he promotes as a midway point between neoliberalism and welfare social welfare. So there's been vociferous debate over whether inclusive liberalism and the third way actually represent a significant shift away, or any shift, from neoliberalism, making policy from more recent years in the last decade or so of particular interest. So New Zealand underwent an inclusive liberal turn, as we say, under self-proclaimed third-way politician Helen Clark and a centre-left Labour government in power from 1999 to 2008. So it is from this background that I arrived on my two major research questions. Firstly, how did adult literacy policy in New Zealand vary between the so-called neoliberal era and the inclusive liberal one? And secondly, what were the key drivers in New Zealand that shifted the policy discourse in adult literacy from 84 to 99 and from 99 to 2008? So how did I approach these research questions? I drew on a policy sociology approach, and I'm borrowing this term here from Australian educational policy analyst Jenny Oscar, who has described policy sociology as an explicit sociological approach to analysing policy that acknowledges the politics of the policy-making process and that considers policy as inseparable from other socio-political actions. In analysing policy specifically, I drew on Balfour and Gold in the context of policy, firstly looking at the context of policy text production, where policy agenda. Secondly, I looked at the context of influence to understand which ideas, people, and organisations have been influential in New Zealand's adult literacy policy development, how and why. And thirdly, I looked at what I called the context of interpretive practices, outcomes, that what Balfour and Gold call the context of practice, to investigate what the responses have been to policy and how policy has been experienced at those at whom it has been aimed. And as Balfour and Gold note, these three contexts exist in a symbiotic relationship between one another. So I drew on three main sets of data in this research. Firstly, I looked at documents that were published by government or government-contracted documents between 1984 to 2008. Secondly, I looked at documents from key literacy organisations today. And thirdly, I conducted interviews with 20 experts in the arena of adult literacy, from government bureaucrats, those literacy policy researchers, and what I call literacy promoters, or those entrusted or who have undertaken to lobby for literacy on behalf of their organisations. So the documents from government were identified through a process of literature search and reading other documents that point to the key documents. Their importance was confirmed to me by participants, and my participants also alerted me to what they thought were the main documents that have been most influential on policy in New Zealand, and as well as the main organisations. So these are the organisations, the unions, of which I looked at their policies and their reports. And the interviewees I identified through a process of snowballing, where interviewees were recommended to me by other interviewees, and organisations were also alerted to me as being influential in New Zealand. And I also was able to identify key literacy organizations and people through the reports I've been reading. For example, they had acted as authors, or they were referred to in the text as key players in the New Zealand adult literacy field. So here I have a toolbox, and I'm borrowing this metaphor from Stephen Ball, who has written that to analyze policy, we need a toolbox filled with a variety of concepts and theories. And so for my research, I drew primarily on ideas from agenda setting and political science, policy transfer from education, interpretive policy analysis as developed mostly by Deborah Yano, and discourse analysis drawing from Fairclough, Edelman, Blackhawk, and Johnson. And from this, I derived my own approach to examining both literacy policy texts and interview texts, which I called 10A analysis. So I sought to understand who the authors of the main texts had been, what the aims of the documents were, what the aims of the organizations were, how policy issues had been articulated in the documents and by my interviewees, and what the approaches to these issues have been and how they were. What the key assertions, assumptions, and agenda was underlying the individual text as a whole, the organizations I was looking at, and my interviewees, and who were the main actors in developing policy, and where relevant, what was the amount being allocated to adult literacy policy, and where was this amount being allocated. So what did I find? Most generally, we can see that there was a cascade of policy introduced in the first part of this decade that was both symbolic and material. And we can also see that prior to this time, there was no mention of adult literacy. But what we do note is that the stage was set, starting in the late 1980s, with massive reforms of the post-secondary education in New Zealand that allowed for further policy development in the next years. So in the context of policy text production, I sought to understand most primarily how policy problems have been articulated and what the proposed approaches to these problems have been. And as we see between the two periods from 1984 up to 2008, the main concerns expressed were labour market gaps and changes in the economy and an underdeveloped, poor quality, inaccessible, and with poor provision, diversity of provision in the tertiary education system. And this was a discourse that continued on throughout all the documents I looked at. So what we do see as a new discourse as a problem is literacy, introduced in the first half of this millennium, that New Zealanders had insufficient literacy skills to address these market gaps. Literacy skills were not being developed within the tertiary education system. In terms of the solutions, again, there was much overlap with the proposed solutions, and they're centered on revising the tertiary education system in general to make it larger, more centralized, standardized, diversified, with access targeted to marginalized groups such as Māori and the Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, and to make it of higher quality. And this resulted in an emphasis specifically on quality assurance and accountability in education. We see three key discourses that have emerged in the last decade or so on collaboration as a solution to building a revised tertiary education system, and more generally, a focus on professionalization of adult educators. And as adult literacy became a focus, a social policy focus of the more recent Labour government, they started to look seriously at how to professionalize the workforce, specifically through the introduction of credentials and teacher education certification. And literacy, again, as a solution to solving these labour market gaps and shifts towards a knowledge economy. So we see some changes in the discourses that took place. And these are some of the key discourses that emerged over the mid to late 1990s, from the mid to late 80s to the mid to late 1990s, around talk of the knowledge economy, skills, global integration, interest groups, and accountability. And we see in some senses these discourses softening, but not disappearing, and the introduction of new discourses under the more recent documents that I looked at focus more on talking about the knowledge society, but it's often not defined. Literacy and IELTS becomes a key discourse in the document. Globalization instead of global integration, focus on social partners and talk of increased consultation. But it is not, as we see, that these discourses disappear by any means, it's just that they're added to, in some senses, become muted. So in the context of policy influence, we see that there were a number of main drivers that helped create policy in New Zealand. From key events such as IELTS and texts such as the Hawke Report that was written in 1988 that transformed the entire landscape of post-secondary education in New Zealand, and the Adult Literacy Strategy, published in 2001. We see the influence of transnational organisations, in particular the OECD, and countries, in particular the UK, in its own Skills for Life project. And we see here a quote from one of my participants that shows some of the policy learning and influence that went on from these two activities. We also see the influence of particular government bodies. Here I'm thinking of the Department of Labour, but not so much the Ministry of Education, which was of interest. Certain national organisations, for example, Workbase, that provide workplace literacy in New Zealand, and key individuals both within government and outside of government. And here's a quote that captures some of this from one of my participants who currently works in government, but who's worked with a number of different places involved in health. So we see also the key role of partnerships, and particularly the social partners, what are called social partners, and these partners have provided an enlightenment function to government, as Limbaugh Woodhouse has noted. And also what Limbaugh Woodhouse has observed is that social partners from the business community or business interests hold a unique privileged position in the creation of policy, and this is also the case in New Zealand. So those partners associated with the economy and workplace had much more influence. And so here's one of the quotes from one of my participants who talks about how he's been able to get his organization's agenda to the attention of government and reason. So this notes the importance of time as well. So the workplace changes in the workplace and the economy were key drivers also of policy development. A concern particularly for quality and control and increasing quality. Centralization of education enabled many of these reforms to take place. And a particular concern for social inclusion, specifically of Māori and Pacific Island community, also helped to propel policy development. So in this last context of interpretive practice, which we can see in some ways as a response to the previous two contexts and the relationship between them, then I would conclude in reflecting on my participants' opinions and ideas that the focus on literacy in New Zealand has been real, and these are some of the quotes that confirm that from my participants, that there's been increased recognition, heightened awareness. There has been the biggest change in the field, for example, that the government is actually finally paying attention to adult literacy. And that this has opened up new spaces for influence for organizations and individuals interested in adult literacy, as well as possibilities for negotiation with government. But at the same time, my participants did reflect that they had some issues with the government's supposed neutral and collaborative approach to policy development, that they claimed wasn't so neutral or collaborative. And they were a bit concerned that the increased demands that have been placed on them would further attempts for demands for accountability. And some also expressed concern that ideas had been imported directly from the UK, for example, or from the OECD into the New Zealand context without much adaptation or consultation. So this quote was from someone in response to my question of how, as I was reflecting on the policy development over the last 10 years, it seems quite cohesive and smooth, and she said basically it's been a story of model, even though it looks like there's been all this creation of policy trajectory. And someone else, I said, well, what do you think about the new collaborative approach of government? And her response was it's basically being top-down economics. But overall, I would say that there's been constraint and opportunity through these recent changes that have taken place over the last decade or so. So in conclusion, I say that adult literacy did become a central part of New Zealand's economic strategy and social policy through a process that firstly expanded on the previous government strategy to upskill New Zealand, intensified discourses of both control and constraint on the one hand, and opportunity and freedom on the other. And control and constraint are present in discourses around centralization, standardization, regulation, evaluation, and of course accountability that continues. And opportunity in discourses of decentralization, deinstitutionalization, and in other ways. And then finally, a process that prioritized practice of workplace literacy, economically related workplace literacy, over community literacy, and targeted social support for marginalized groups such as women, rather than a holistic welfare approach. So we see, in accordance with an inclusive liberal approach to policy, that there's been a return to some Keynesian aspects of major centralization and standardization in education. And in other ways, we see also a very inclusive liberal approach to social welfare policy that has not been holistic, but rather targeted on specific groups. And so there'll be three, I will note briefly here to conclude that three avenues of recommendations that emerge from my research. Firstly, concerning those who are on the receiving end of policy and who wish to influence policy. So my research suggests the importance of coalescing with other groups and individuals in getting your concern to the attention of government and resonating with the government's existing agenda. And my research shows how successful that has been in some cases in this context. There are recommendations for those creating policy. And my study really draws attention to the need for clearer lines of communication between the policy arena and practice arena. In particular, there was concern of institutional memory loss due to high turnover and a fundamental disconnect between policy and practice. My study also highlights the need for inclusion of certain interest groups in the policy-making process, such as Māori, but this has significance beyond the New Zealand context in general. And finally, my research suggests certain potential avenues for further research. Firstly, I think it would be of interest to do a similar study in another country that has undertaken policy reform following IELTS with a similar political economy, such as the UK, or a different one, such as Sweden, which has a more social democratic model. And I also think, to conclude, that it would be interesting to come back maybe in a few years and look at what happens to adult literacy policy in New Zealand now, maybe in 10 years' time, a few years' time, following the election of the centre-right government in 2008, the economic downturn that we experienced since then, and the possible economic ramifications of the recent earthquake, to see how stable the policy that has been created in recent years is, in looking futuristically, and comparing future policy with policy that has occurred in the two previous eras. So on that note, I will end, and thank you very much.